Everybody makes their own decisions and everybody makes their own choices, but they're not the only ones that suffer the consequences. Everyone around them does.
For many years, the Duggar family appeared to be the picture of wholesome American values. With their strict Christian beliefs, matching outfits, and constant smiles, they became a household name through TLC's reality shows 19 Kids and Counting and later Counting On. Millions of viewers tuned in to watch their daily routines, their family trips, and their courtship traditions that followed strict rules about dating and physical contact. To the outside world, the Duggars seemed like a family who lived in harmony, guided by faith and untouched by the problems that many others face. However, behind this carefully created image, Jill Duggar, the fourth daughter in the family, was living under a system that controlled nearly every part of her life. At 34 years old, Jill has finally spoken openly about the real experiences she had, and her words reveal a story that is very different from what viewers saw on television. Her account shows how the Duggar family's way of life was not only strict, but often manipulative, and how the TV empire was built on secrets, contracts, and control. The world Jill describes is one where appearance mattered more than reality, and where silence was often demanded in order to keep the brand alive. What she has now shared sheds light on why Counting On came to an end. Not just because of scandals, but because of a family system that could not survive once the truth began to come out. Jill's childhood was shaped by her parents' deep devotion to the teachings of the Institute and Basic Life Principles, a fundamentalist organization that demanded complete obedience to authority and strict separation from worldly influences. Life inside the Duggar home was filled with rules about dress, behavior, and even thought. Girls were expected to wear modest clothing, homeschooling was a must, and all courtships were supervised and limited. Jill recalls how people would stare in wonder at her large family whenever they went out, often amazed at seeing so many children dressed alike and lined up neatly. To the outside world, these rules seemed unusual but charming. But inside, they created a system where the father held near total power. Questioning authority was seen as rebellion against God, and independence was treated as dangerous. For Jill, this meant that even as she grew older, her choices were not really her own. She was taught that her father's word was final, and later her husband's word would take that place. What seemed like discipline and order to TV audiences was actually a system that controlled every detail of her life, from her education to her relationships. This level of control prepared the ground for later manipulation, including situations where she signed contracts without understanding what she was agreeing to. As Jill explains now, the environment she grew up in trained her to accept control without question, and that foundation made it possible for exploitation to happen, quietly for years. One of the most shocking parts of Jill's story is what happened the night before her wedding to Derek Dillard in 2014, at a moment when she should have been filled with joy and anticipation. Her father, Jim Bob Duggar, presented her with a legal contract. He told her it was just routine paperwork that needed to be signed before the wedding, and trusting him, as she had been conditioned to do, Jill signed it without reading the fine print or asking for legal advice. Later, her husband Derek, who had studied law, looked at the contract and was stunned. It was written in a way that heavily favored Jim Bob and the family business. It required Jill to continue filming for TLC and gave her no direct control over the money the show earned. Payments for each episode, which were tens of thousands of dollars, went straight to Jim Bob, leaving Jill with nothing of her own, despite being one of the central figures on the show. Jill has admitted she feels tricked, saying she was too excited and too trusting to realize the trap she was being placed into. This wedding contract did more than just affect money. It meant her personal life, from her first kiss at the altar to the birth of her children, was turned into television content. Her wedding, which should have been a private and sacred event, became a carefully managed TV spectacle watched by millions, and the profits went to others while she was left with emotional stress and financial dependence. After her wedding, Jill became one of the main stars of Counting On. Her marriage, pregnancies, and early years of motherhood provided endless storylines that kept fans glued to the screen. Over the years, she filmed more than 200 episodes and specials, many of which focused directly on her personal life. But behind the cameras, Jill was not receiving the financial benefits of this attention. The money flowed into her father's control, and Jill herself saw little or none of it. What audiences saw as heartwarming family milestones were, for her, experiences shared under pressure, often before she had the chance to process them privately. Imagine welcoming your first child, but instead of it being a deeply personal moment, it is filmed, packaged, and broadcast to millions. That was Jill's reality. The constant filming blurred the lines between her personal identity and her role as a television character. Over time, the psychological burden grew heavier, as she realized her life was being shaped not by her own choices, but by storylines designed for television ratings. The Duggar family empire thrived on her authenticity and vulnerability, yet she was never properly compensated. Jill's story reveals how reality TV can turn real lives into profitable entertainment, while those at the center may remain controlled and exploited without realizing the full cost until much later. In 2015, everything changed when reports surfaced that Jill's brother, Josh Duggar, had molested several girls, including Jill herself, when he was a teenager. The news shocked the public and devastated the Duggar family's carefully built image of morality and purity. Jill had actually been brave enough to report the abuse years earlier, but no real consequences had followed. When the story became public, TLC pulled 19 Kids and Counting from the air, and the family scrambled to protect their reputation. Instead of centering their daughter's trauma and offering support, Jim, Bob, and Michelle focused on damage control. Jill and her sister Jessa were pressured into giving a Fox News interview, where they defended the family and downplayed what had happened. Jill now admits she did not want to be there, but she felt she had no choice. The same conditioning that had taught her to obey made her feel responsible for helping her parents save the show. Even more disturbing, Josh himself was reportedly present during the interview, though off camera, while his victims were asked to publicly minimize his actions. This moment showed how deeply the family system prioritized protecting its brand over supporting its daughters. Although TLC later launched Counting On as a replacement show without Josh, the foundation of trust within the family was already crumbling. For Jill, the realization that her pain had been used for public relations was a turning point. As the years went by, Jill and Derek began questioning the system that demanded so much of them. They wanted a life where they could make decisions freely, without the constant pressure of cameras or family expectations. But even small steps toward independence created huge conflicts. When Jill chose to wear pants instead of skirts or got a nose ring, these simple personal choices were treated as acts of rebellion against the family's values. When she and Derek considered stepping back from filming, they faced threats that the show would be canceled, and it would all be their fault. Jill recalls being told that their refusal to participate could ruin everything, a tactic designed to guilt her into compliance. For the first time, however, Jill had a partner in Derek who encouraged her to see the manipulation for what it was. His outside perspective made her realize that what she had been taught was normal was actually unhealthy control. Still, the price of independence was high. Walking away from the show meant losing financial support and facing estrangement from much of her family. Jill admits that her parents seemed more willing to protect Josh than to support her, and this painful truth pushed her further toward building her own path. Choosing her well-being over obedience marked the beginning of the end, not only of her relationship with her father, but of Counting On itself. While many people believe Counting On ended simply because of the family's scandals, Jill's story reveals a deeper reason. The show relied on willing participation from family members who were under their parents' control. Once Jill and others started speaking up and stepping away, the foundation of the show began to fall apart. Jill had been one of the most compelling figures on the program, and without her cooperation, the storylines lost their emotional center. At the same time, more and more people began questioning the Duggar family's treatment of abuse victims, compared to their protection of Josh. Viewers no longer wanted to support a show that seemed built on silencing victims and promoting an image that wasn't real. When Josh was later arrested and convicted for receiving child pornography, the family's reputation was permanently damaged. TLC realized the Duggar brand had become too toxic to maintain, and the show could no longer continue without serious backlash. In the end, Counting On was not just canceled because of outside pressure or falling ratings, but because the truth made it impossible to keep the illusion going. Jill's choice to speak out and prioritize her own well-being helped reveal the cracks in a system that had depended on silence and control. Today, Jill's relationship with her parents remains strained. She has limited contact with her mother, usually only at family gatherings, and her connection with Jim Bob is even more distant. What was once daily control has now become almost complete estrangement. Jill admits there is tension, but she accepts it as part of her journey toward freedom. Some of her siblings, like Jinger and cousin Amy Duggar King, have also spoken out about the family's strict structure, while others remain loyal to Jim Bob. Jill and Derek now focus on raising their 3 sons in a healthier environment, one where choices are allowed and children are not bound by extreme rules. Jill describes this process as disentangling herself from the teaching she grew up with. recognizing both the positive and negative experiences but choosing not to repeat the harmful patterns. For her, breaking free has meant building a new identity apart from the Duggar brand, even though it cost her relationships and financial stability. Her story serves as both a warning about the dangers of reality TV exploitation and a testament to the strength it takes to walk away from control. The real reason counting on ended lies, not in one scandal, but in the courage of people like Jill to stop playing a role and start living for themselves. Reality television has a way of turning private lives into public property, and Jill Duggar's story is one of the clearest examples of this. When TLC first introduced the Duggar family through documentaries and later full seasons of 19 Kids and Counting, the network framed them as wholesome entertainment. Viewers tuned in not just to watch a large family, but to see a version of Christian conservatism that felt both unusual and charming. TLC marketed the Duggars as role models for modesty, discipline, and traditional values. But behind the scenes, the line between real life and performance quickly blurred. For Jill, the cameras were not just occasional guests in her home. They were a constant presence. Family events, from graduations to birthdays, were planned around filming schedules. Even milestones like her courtship and wedding were treated less as personal choices and more as episodes of a TV series. This raised a difficult question. When every moment of your life is monetized and turned into content, how much of your identity belongs to you? Jill's later realization that she had signed away rights to her own image shows how reality TV can quietly take control of the very people it portrays. The network may have claimed to simply observe, but in truth, the Duggar brand was carefully shaped for ratings. For Jill, this meant living in a world where private struggles were hidden while cheerful family life was highlighted, creating a pressure to smile, even when the reality was painful. A key part of Jill's story is the role that religion played in keeping her silent for so long. The Duggar family followed strict teachings that emphasized female submission, male authority, and unquestioned obedience. These beliefs were reinforced not only in church, but also in everyday family life. From a young age, Jill was told that her father represented God's authority in her life, and later her husband would take that place. This structure left little room for independent decision-making. When Jill signed her wedding contract, it was not just a legal mistake. It was the product of years of conditioning that taught her not to challenge authority figures. Asking questions or seeking a lawyer's opinion would have been seen as disrespectful. Similarly, when she was pressured into the Fox News interview about Josh, her training in obedience made it almost impossible to say no. This influence extended into the smallest details of her life, from how she dressed to how she spoke in public. Even as an adult, Jill struggled with guilt whenever she made choices that went against her parents' teachings, such as wearing pants or piercing her nose. These simple actions may seem minor to outsiders, but for Jill, they represented breaking free from decades of control. Her journey shows how deeply religious authority can shape behavior, and how much strength it takes to reclaim independence when faith has been used as a tool for control. Walking away from the Duggar family system came at a very high emotional cost for Jill. For much of her life, family was not just important, it was everything. With so many siblings, cousins, and extended relatives, gatherings were always full of activity, and Jill had been taught that loyalty to family was next to loyalty to God. But when she began questioning the contracts, the money, and the constant filming, her parents saw her not as a daughter seeking freedom, but as a threat to the family's brand. The tension grew until Jill and Derek found themselves excluded from events, often learning about family news through social media rather than direct conversations. Jill has admitted that this estrangement was heartbreaking, especially because she still loves her parents and siblings deeply. She described times when she cried over the distance and wished things could be different, but also realized that returning to silence and control would mean betraying her own values. The pain is made worse